We have spent a lot of time discussing negative controls in multiple episodes so far, but what about their counterparts? In this episode, we will start talking about positive controls in life science experiments. My current plan is to talk about them in 2 or 3 episodes, and then move on to reading the text of our Milestone Article 1. Hi everyone, welcome to the Foundational Skills in Life Sciences podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Synaptologica. We discuss the skills that life science scholars learn, use, and improve throughout professional activities. Your benefit is expressed in my motto, learn the skills, enjoy academic life. Last episodes in the mini-series. We are in a long mini-series of reading a life science paper. Today, we are in episode 28. If you are a new listener of my episodes, please start listening from episode 7. It was the start of the mini-series of reading. Recently, we have spent a lot of time on negative controls. In 7 episodes, from episode 19 through 26, we have discussed the negative controls in very detail. We did it by focusing on one story about an experiment that failed at first, but that started working well after extensive troubleshooting. I hope that you have a deeper understanding of negative controls after hearing those episodes. When you read any paper from now on, you will enjoy thinking about negative controls in the paper. I would be very happy if you feel that way. Summary of steps for reading the Milestone article. After talking about negative controls, it would be natural for us to talk about positive controls. But before talking about positive controls, let's quickly review the steps in our mini-series on reading. Those steps were for reading the Milestone Article 1, written by the Nobel Laureates. The paper was published in 2005, and it eventually led to the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine 2023. I have copied a link to the paper in the episode description, so click it to read it. We would like to review the steps here because it has been a long time since we talked about the steps before. While we discussed the advanced features of negative controls recently, we have been staying outside the Milestone article. And we are now coming back to the Milestone article for discussing positive controls. From steps 1 through 6, we watched the presentation video by the Nobel Committee, and we located the Milestone article. In step 7, we reviewed our fundamental questions, which are quaestiones fundamentales, according to our Latin notation. Because of this step, our brains will be ready for reading the abstract, introduction, and discussion sections, or AID sections. In step 8, we confirmed the paper identity and read the title of the paper. The title is the first scientific information that we encounter in a paper. We read it, although the reading was very superficial. In step 9, we surveyed the entire written text and located the major sections. So we quickly covered the written text in steps 8 and 9. In step 10, we covered the figures. We counted the number of figures in the Milestone article and scanned the figures roughly for how they looked like. In step 11, we focused on understanding the Milestone graph. This graph, or a figure panel, was shown in the presentation video by the Nobel Committee. This graph is in figure 3D, D as in dog, and it is the most important graph in our Milestone Article 1. We examined this graph and its related figure panels in detail. Step 11 had 5 substeps so far. In step 11-1, we interpreted the basic elements of the graph by identifying the horizontal and vertical axes of the bar graph. In step 11-2, we looked for explanations of the graph in the figure legend. In step 11-3, we deciphered the labels in the graph, that is, any text elements that could help us understand the graph. In step 11-4, we understood the basic experimental conditions by reading the axis labels. In the specific examples in this article, the category axis labels were structured in a beautiful manner. so that the labels indicate the experimental conditions visually and clearly. In step 11-5, we identified the negative control in the milestone graph. As the advanced extension of step 11-5, we broadened our discussion about negative controls more generally to outside the milestone graph. There, we discussed our modified definition of negative controls. It said that a negative control is a sample where the expected outcome is thought to be absent. We further discussed two assumptions for negative controls. Negative controls will work when either of the assumptions is satisfied. To give you clear ideas about the modified definition and the assumptions of negative controls, we discussed a story about a pilot experiment that failed at first, but was made successful after troubleshooting. Here are the key words as reminders: the negative controls and the serum in culture medium. Today's episode. Now that we have discussed negative controls, the next sub-step will be to discuss their counterparts, that is, the positive controls. The single sub-step is step 11-6, identify the positive controls of experiments. In today's episode, we will define what we mean by positive controls of life science experiments. In the next episode, we will look at the examples of positive controls in our Milestone Article 1. Definitions of positive controls. We will proceed in the same way as we did for negative controls in our previous episode 18. We will talk about a typical definition of positive controls first, and then we will modify it. There may be multiple ways of defining positive controls. I will show you two examples of typical definitions. One example can go like this. A positive control group will be exposed to a treatment that is known to change the experimental readout. Another example is, a positive control is a sample where the expected outcome is known to be present. So the experimenters can produce a known result in a positive control group. Based on this result, the experimenters can confirm that their experimental system is working well. They can also use the positive control as a reference for comparison, so that the results of the test group can be compared with the positive and negative controls. In many cases, these typical definitions will work. But we saw in our latest story that a typical definition of negative controls has a risk of conveying a wrong message. And the wrong message is that the known negative controls should always work well. We saw that it is not always the case. We learned it in a story about a pilot experiment that failed at first, but was made successful after troubleshooting. So we want to modify our definition of positive controls in a similar way. We would like to rephrase it by changing a single word for our purpose. The modified definition will be, a positive control is a sample where the expected outcome is thought to be present. So the part known to be present in a typical definition is modified to thought to be present. The reason for why we want to modify the definition of positive controls is because a positive control in one experiment does not necessarily work as a positive control in another experiment. We will see such examples in the next episode. Universal assumptions for positive controls. For negative controls, we developed two assumptions. Negative controls should satisfy either of those assumptions. But at least for now, I cannot think of a similar helpful assumptions for positive controls that will apply to any experiment universally. So let's not discuss them here. Comment: labels as positive or negative controls. It would be the easiest for readers of a paper if the authors state clearly that in this experiment, this group is a positive control and that group is a negative control, and mention the same way for every experiment in the entire paper. But I think it is very rare to find a paper like that. Quite often, the groups are not labeled as positive controls or negative controls. Whether an experimental group is a positive control, a negative control, or a test group depends on the previous results and the goal of the specific experiment in the paper. Let's look at our Milestone Article 1 as an example. The full terms positive control or negative control did not show up in any part of the paper. But the word control appeared 7 times, either as a positive control or a negative control. It was used as a positive control twice, and it was used as a negative control 5 times. So when we read any paper, we will need to interpret each experimental condition carefully for answering the questions, which group is a positive control and which group is a negative control? When we read a paper carefully, the meaning of the experimental condition will be clear, or at least I would say that the meaning of the experimental condition will be clear to us if the authors of the paper are careful writers. Then, which sections of the paper shall we read to understand the positive and negative controls? Usually, the results section is the best for that purpose. Sometimes the methods section will be helpful too. At other times, the information can be scattered in the introduction section and the figure legends as well. To have a good understanding of which conditions are positive and negative controls, I would suggest reading the results section first, using the graph labels as a guide for the experimental conditions. If the information is not completely available in the results section, then we will expand our reading to other sections of the paper. This is the end of the main content today. Summary. Today, we have reviewed the 11 steps for reading our Milestone Article 1. Then we started talking about a new substep, 11-6, which was to identify the positive controls of experiments. We proposed to modify a common definition of positive controls to a more practical one. The modified definition is, a positive control is a sample where the expected outcome is thought to be present. In the next episode, we will talk about the examples of positive controls in our Milestone Article 1. Your action. If you like my podcast, please share it with your friends, colleagues, mentors, or anybody who would be interested in it. This way, you and I can extend the reach. The bigger the audience becomes, the more feedback we can get, the better the episode quality will grow, and the more you and I can learn. Thank you for joining me in today's episode of Foundational Skills in Life Sciences. I'm Dr. Synaptologica. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.